Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jenny. Today is quite a special day because it's about the environment. And we need to, if we're going to survive, we need to really pay attention to all of this. And I'll just say a little bit about FIWAL before we go into that part of the programme, because there's so many guests here today who won't have heard or even met anybody from FIWAL. And it might be good for them to have a little bit of background. Well, FIWAL was founded in 1986, and it's an umbrella organisation with 33 member clubs and growing, and with an international reach of at least 3,500 women. We've got a strong team of executives who look after all aspects of FIWAL, and in particular our wonderful events programme. And we offer a wide variety of events throughout the year. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we've been restricted in the types of events that we can, you know, that would have been cooking, for example. It's lovely when you've got somebody in front of you doing it, but we have had cooking programs. More recently, we've had, I think it was in October, November time, we had a speaker talking about the Beirut catastrophe with that big explosion, and we've had follow-up from that. And this is a typical example of where we would donate to their charity, the charity of their choice. And then we've recently had backup on how that money has been used very wisely. Today, of course, I pay tribute to Lesley Malpas, who is an extraordinary woman. She's done so much in her time to take us to this stage of events in enrolling the young people in what they can do about the environment, because we are very, very reliant on them. It's their world now. As my granddaughter once said, "You lot created it. Now what are you going to do about it? It's up to us." And this is true. It's the young people who will carry the torch forward. And Lesley is the founder and CEO of the company, and the creator of Future Hope, and the School Award to do with Future Hope. And it's all to do with restoring wildlife to land and getting the young people to develop an interest in nature. It's doing extraordinarily well, and you will hear more about that from Julia in a few moments. So there will be a question and answer session at the end, and I'm sure it will be very busy. So jot down anything you need to ask about, because it's quite a big subject. I'm delighted to have so many of you here today. It's a tribute to the interest in this subject. So back to you, please, Jenny.
Thank you. Well, Lesley, over to you. Thank you very much for those words, Siobhan.
Lovely. Well, it's fantastic to be here and to see all your faces. Absolutely wonderful. And to have this opportunity to tell you about Operation Future Hope. I started Operation Future Hope 3 years ago as a direct response to learning about the state of nature while studying a degree course for conservation and wildlife management. What stunned me was the sheer scale of biodiversity loss and the fact that very little was being said about it in the media. We were hearing lots about climate change, but hardly anything was being said about biodiversity loss. Before I tell you about the work that we do in schools, I'd just like to give you a snapshot into the state of nature so that you can just appreciate for yourselves exactly the scale of loss that we're talking about. So the state of nature today, right now on the planet, 96% of mammals on Earth today comprise of humans, livestock, and our pets. Only 4% of wild animals remain. This is a devastating statistic. You might think, why have we got a picture of badgers in the background here? Well, for me, they symbolize at the moment the war against nature in our own country. And have a look at the Badger Trust website and find out about the ongoing cull that's happening. But it's because of things like this that we have this shocking statistic. It's not just mammals, it's all species. So in the last 50 years, we've experienced a 68% decline in land and marine wildlife. We have 200 species becoming extinct each day. That's 1,000 times the normal background extinction rate. And we now need 1.7 Earth's worth of resources each year. We're using 7 times more than the planet is able to regenerate. So we're actually taking from our children. So we hear these statistics, we probably think, well, that must be the rest of the world. You know, we're in Britain, we're fine. Well, actually, that's not the case. Britain is one of the worst nations in the world in terms of biodiversity loss. We're actually 29th from the bottom out of 218 nations. And it's largely down to the way that we manage our land in this country, intensive farming, but also to the way that we manage our public spaces, our schools, our gardens. We've seen a staggering decline of 420 million birds from the British countryside since 1980. We've lost 75% of our invertebrates. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows. And it's across all species. We don't have time to go into this list compiled by Chris Packham, but you can see by glancing at it the statistics of 90%, 80%, 70% decline of many of British species. Michael Clark, CEO of RSPB, says Britain has one last chance to save its endangered species. So is there still hope? Well, yes, there is. We are at 2 minutes to midnight, but it is not too late. And at Operation Future Hope, we believe that children actually very much are the answer. And that as we educate them, they in turn will influence their families and their communities. But environmental education is failing them because it's not keeping pace with environmental degradation. And this is where at Operation Future Hope, we step in. So we have launched the Conservation School Award. We work in schools in 2 ways. Firstly, through education, teaching young people about nature, about the statistics I've just shared with you, teaching them about a different way of being in the world. We cannot continue to consume through the teeth, if you like, of an industrial, mechanistic, consumerist society. We've got to change our way of being and write a new story. And we help young people to understand what nature needs to survive and thrive. We teach them how to make rewilding management plans. And then we give them hope by actually getting stuck in on the ground, physically rewilding their school grounds. So to just give you 2 examples, here we have a map. This is Sherborne Girls' School. When we go into a school, we don't just create a little corner for wildlife. We go at landscape scale and we look at what we can do across the entire site. So we're looking about new hedgerows, hedgerow restoration, wildflower banks, wildflower meadows, lavender walks, spring meadows, orchards, ponds, nest boxes, a whole landscape scale. And here at Sherborne Girls, you can see the top left picture. It is an image of the perimeter of the sports field. This is a pretty standard habitat across all schools. It's just monoculture grassland that goes right up to the boundary. Hedgerows are intensely managed, and there's nothing here for wildlife. So in this situation, there was topsoil stripping, and 6 schools came together to sow the meadow. And that was in April of 2019, and by July, August, you can see the transformation here. We now have long grass margins, wildflower meadows, hedgerows restored. We've got a wildflower pond in there, an orchard at the top. And as you can see, it doesn't affect the functionality of the sports facilities at all, but a wonderful way for children to learn at school. This is a completely different example of a state school. The bottom left picture shows, again, mowed grass and the intensely managed hedgerows. At the base of the hedgerow here is actually, it's all been sprayed off with herbicide, which we see in pretty much all schools we go to. It would have stayed like that all year round had it not been for our rewilding management plan and changing the way they manage the land. Here, it was purely natural regeneration. You can see us doing some quadrite sampling with the students above. And in the summer of that year, we ended up with this. And that was purely through allowing natural regeneration. Not one seed was sown. And here we've got hawksbit, self-heal, yarrow, all sorts of wildflowers that were just arrested in that intensive management, lying dormant, now able to be liberated. So what are we doing now? Well, next we are wanting to roll out the Conservation School Award across more of Dorset. We're already working with schools in Dorset, Somerset and Wiltshire. We want to expand, we want to go across the southwest, and we see no reason why this can't be a national initiative. And so I just want to thank you so much for all of your wonderful support. We want to reach more schools, educate more children, rewild more school grounds. So on behalf of all of nature and of future generations, we just say thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to hand back to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Lesley. That was a very enlightening talk, and shocking to hear those figures, the millions of birds that have disappeared, and 200 species going every day. Quite shocking, and it's just so good to hear what you're doing with the schools. I know many of you have already donated when you bought your tickets, and we thank you for that. If you haven't donated, and having listened to Lesley's talk, feel that you really would like to do something more to help, there are a number of ways you can do so. Transfer to FIWAL through that. Alternatively, the website for Operation Future Hope, and you can donate by debit card or by PayPal. So thank you all for that. We're now moving on to introducing Julia, and we were so thrilled when Julia agreed to talk to us. Julia is a sustainability pioneer with over 30 years in the green sector, who, as many of you know, co-authored the Green Consumer Guide, which sold over 1 million copies worldwide. And in 1987, she co-founded the leading consultancy and think tank, Sustainability. Since then, Julia has co-founded Hala, a charity promoting sustainability agriculture in Kenya, and sat on the boards of many charities, including Keep Britain Tidy and Chase Africa, which she joined in 2018. Julia describes herself as a green campaigner, writer, speaker, and consultant. And we found a clip from her early days in sustainability, and I thought you might like to hear how the media in 1988 described Julia.
With. So much so that this book, The Green Consumer Guide, is currently #1 of the non-fiction paperback bestsellers, and we've got Julia Hales with us, who is one of the authors of it.
And Julia Hales, who's the co-author of The Green Consumer Guide. In a moment, we'll be talking to environmentalist Julia Hales.
Well, we're joined now by environmentalist Julia Hales. Good morning to you, Julia.
Good morning. We're joined this morning by Julia Hales, who's an environmentalist and author of The Green Consumer Guide.
And on to now, The Late Show.
I think the green consumer is a reality. I think when we first thought of the green consumer, John Elkington actually conceived the idea in 1986. At that stage, he didn't know whether the green consumer existed. It's something that has begun to exist. There are people who are going out there and they are buying one product over another on the basis of its environmental acceptability.
Joining me are John Elkington, co-author of The Green Consumer Guide.
Green consumerism was actually meant to make some of the green message rather more palatable. And when we started, I must say, most people advised us not to use green, not to touch it with a barge pole, because it was actually unacceptable. People didn't want to go back and live in wigwams in Wales.
What about the argument that it's a middle-class fad and that green is a whole load of hocus pocus?
I think there are very few people who think that green is a hocus pocus. I think most people realise that green and environmental issues are absolutely key.
Is it trendy to be green yet?
And I'd now like to hand over to Julia herself to tell us about her green life. Please join me in welcoming Julia Hales.
Okay, hello. When I was a baby, my brother painted me green. Perhaps it was a sign of things to come. But it's really difficult to know exactly when I started on my green career, but also most importantly, when I started thinking about it. I went for a lot of walks with my father when I was little, and we used to discuss all the issues around the world. And I really like to attribute it to him as making me think about those issues. I also went to stay, I'd done a lot of traveling in my life, and I went to stay in, I think it was 1983, in the Pantanal, which is in the west of Brazil, a wonderful wetland area with lots of forest and things. And the really shocking thing was, on my next slide, that's my brother, the one with the curly hair in the middle is the one that painted me green. And this is the Pantanal. And I stayed in this luxury place, but they, I discovered, were actually responsible for chopping down swathes of the forest. And that really hit me. I just couldn't really believe that they could do something so dreadful. I then went, later on in my trip, I went and crewed on a yacht in the Caribbean. And this is me on the top right of the screen on the yacht. And I often say, if I use this slide, I caused a bit of a sensation on this boat, and it wasn't because I was topless, because they threw all the rubbish from the boat into the sea, which was unbelievable. You know, plastics, metal, bottles, everything. And then when they came to, you know, lovely remote island and noticed the rubbish on the ground, they complained and I said, well, this is because of what you're doing on this yacht. And so that was probably the first time of really making people think about that it's not just somebody else that's doing it, it's you. Anyway, before I left the yacht, I managed to stop them throwing all the stuff into the sea. They had to, if they brought it on, they had to be able to take it off again. The real start was when I teamed up with John, when I came back from my travels. And quite shortly after we met and started working together, we set up a company called Sustainability. And actually nobody really understood what sustainability meant in those days. We used to get letters saying substantiability and all sorts of things, saying that people had not any idea what we were talking about. And it was also quite uncool, and people thought that people were a bit odd who were green. And in fact, I did my very first radio interview on Radio Derby. Luckily, I haven't been to Derby since. And they asked me about it, and I said, well, environmentalists are no longer long-haired hippies with open-toed sandwiches. And obviously, because I had not done a lot of talking on the radio before, I then went on to correct myself to make sure that everyone had really understood that I said sandwiches rather than sandals. It was actually John who was the most fantastic person in terms of linking. He'd been sort of advising business for a while, but he really linked the fact that if you're going to get businesses on board to change, you needed to show them that there was an opportunity in becoming green. You couldn't just say, you're just so dirty, we don't like you, we'd rather you don't exist. You have to show them that if they do things better, they will have more customers and it will be better. So that was really, really key. When we wrote the Green Consumer Guide, I was probably the one that made it really accessible and understandable to a very large audience. I had this sort of vision of Mrs. Bloggs, and if Mrs. Bloggs wasn't going to be interested or didn't understand what we were saying, then that was out. So we always had to come back to Mrs. Bloggs, and of course it was incredibly successful. It completely shocked us. It had 11 print runs in the first few weeks. It sold over 1 million copies worldwide. It was published in over 20 countries all over the world. We think that, you know, if we hadn't written it, somebody else would have done, because it was just the right book at the right time. It hit the zeitgeist. And one of the things that was really amusing is that we wrote the Green Consumer Guide. It was published in September 1988. And in conjunction with it, we organised Green Consumer Week. And we got bookshops involved, we got environmental organisations involved, we got lots of PR. We had a wonderful PR agency who helped us. And it felt a little bit like we were the sort of Wizard of Oz, because we were in John's back room in Barnes, organising all these things, making it sound like this was a huge event. And one journalist who interviewed me said, weren't we very lucky that it was Green Consumer Week exactly at the time that we were launching the Green Consumer Guide? Of course, was rather hilarious. At this point, I was going to show the video, but luckily it's been shown before, so we don't have to worry about the technicalities. Now, when we wrote the Green Consumer Guide, we really thought that it would alienate large corporations and make them a bit scared of what we were doing, because we didn't just, you know, say the good things. We actually identified people and some of the bad things that they were doing as well. The interesting thing is that it was totally the reverse of that. In fact, all these big companies came towards us and they said, you know, we realise environment's really important. What on earth do we do about it? So we were advising all these big corporates. One of them you'll see there is ICI. I went to give a speech at ICI because one of the big issues was about chlorofluorocarbons and the destruction of the ozone layer. CFCs, as chlorofluorocarbons known as, ICI was the biggest manufacturer of them. Now, I went to give them a speech, making, of course, a really punchy point about their CFCs. And I got a really hostile reception because ICI felt that I was like a sort of Greenpeace representative, and they were very nervous about the sort of campaigning organisations. There hadn't been a sort of understanding about business really working with people who were concerned about green issues. So it was, you know, really waking up to that. But I was also very fascinated at 25 or whatever to get these big companies actually listening to what I was saying, which is really extraordinary. And in fact, sustainability was the first environmental consultancy of its kind. Now there are many, many others. When we took quite a campaigning approach, we didn't want to work with companies if they weren't interested in changing. So basically, you know, if they wanted to lie below the radar and not really make a lot of noise about what they were doing, then we were not the company for them. So the next book that we did was actually the supermarket guide, and that was particularly relevant because when we were writing the Green Consumer Guide, I did the research now, and I rang up the supermarkets and I asked them about their environmental policies and what green products they were selling, and they had no idea what I was talking about, and they just thought that it must be health issues, E for additives or that type of thing. But actually, when I did the same research a year later, a few months after the Green Consumer Guide had been published, every single supermarket had an environmental manager. It really happened that quickly because they realized that the green consumer was their customer. And so it really illustrated the power of market forces. We actually sent out a 99-page questionnaire to the supermarkets, asking them all these detailed questions about the different products they were selling. And they used it, most of them used it as a sort of Bible as to all the things they should be doing. So they may not have been doing them then, but they started doing them thereafter. So that was really exciting because we realized that we could have an impact. And of course, once we got that ball rolling, we had a number of other books you can see here, New Foods Guide, Manual 2000. The most important probably is the Young Green Consumer Guide, and that was the third one that came out. We didn't so much list the brand names in that, but we had lovely cartoons in there. And one of the most effective things is that we actually did, launching the Green Consumer Guide, the Young Green Consumer Guide, we did a sort of green school competition, and we got the children to have a look at and do an environmental audit of their school to find out what they were doing. And the winners of the Green School competition was a school where the children had actually found out they left the heating, the school left the heating on all night. And by telling the school to turn it off at night, they saved them £15,000 a year. So there was a sort of double win. But it actually got the children involved. So that was really exciting to see that worked. Now, one of the issues that was really quite scary was that when we produced the Green Consumer Guide, we said that McDonald's had been implicated in the destruction of the rainforests. And McDonald's didn't pick it up immediately, but when they did pick it up, they tried to sue us and they tried to take all the books off the shelves. So that was pretty awful. And we went to our lawyers, or we found some lawyers because we didn't have some immediately, and they said, well, actually, it doesn't really matter whether you're right or wrong because they're very powerful. They've got a lot of money and they can absolutely squish you. So we were trying to work out what to do. And John then went and did an interview, a radio interview in Wales. And it turned out there were some McDonald's executives in the audience. And so he was talking about this and what was happening and how we were having this bit of trouble. And the McDonald's executives who were in the audience called the people in America, and they flew over to come and meet us and discuss what we were saying and what we were doing. And in fact, at the meeting, McDonald's then asked us to work for them, which we didn't agree to do. And they did let us keep the books on the shelves. So luckily we didn't have to take them off. And we came to some sort of agreement. I actually didn't really have much contact with McDonald's for almost 20 years after that. Just before I was publishing our new Green Consumer Guide, McDonald's also came into trouble. And I think I should have put this slide up before. So you see it says McLibel in the book in the middle. After we had our run-in with McDonald's, there was another think Greenpeace London activists who really did blast McDonald's much worse than what we did. But it resulted in the longest legal case in British history, and it was called the McLibel case. And although McDonald's in theory won at least some of the things, in practice they absolutely lost. And because the PR was incredibly negative and the people involved didn't really have anything to lose, so they just stood up and really stood their ground about what McDonald's were doing. So I think it was a real turning point for the company in terms of thinking, well, maybe taking a legal approach wasn't the best. Going forwards almost 20 years, is that actually Greenpeace then focus on McDonald's again, and they said, look, you're using soya, which has been grown on rainforest land for your chicken feed. And instead of McDonald's focusing on taking them to court and telling them that they, weren't allowed to say that, what they actually did was that they flew out to have a look at where the soya was grown, and they decided they were not going to source any more soya from there, and they were going to encourage others to stop sourcing soya from that source as well. So that was really fantastic, because it was a sea change in terms of their approach. And so I was rather impressed with that. So when they asked me to go and do a speech in Naples to McDonald's executives, I agreed to go. And I made, as I generally do, quite a punchy speech to the executives about all the issues that were still a problem with McDonald's. And anyway, they seemed to quite like it, because they then invited me to go to Chicago. In Naples, it had been like 20 or 30 executives. In Chicago, it was several hundred executives. And I was told to be quite challenging and provocative and to say what I didn't like. So I started saying, well, actually, I hate McDonald's. And then I explained a little bit about my background with them. But I was also encouraging about the things that they could do and how they could make their changes, and focused on a huge range of issues, because there are lots of issues which are relevant. There's the packaging and the meat, and then all those funny little gizmos that they give away and things like that. At the end of that, the executive who invited me said, well, we asked Julia to be challenging and provocative, and she sure as hell fulfilled her brief. So I was rather proud about that. I also would like to point out that I didn't eat their hamburgers in this shot. That I was taken, this was in Chicago, I was taken there to their store to try them out, and I think their chips are rather good, but I was thinking that I really didn't want to eat their hamburger, which is reinforced by my approach today in relation to meat. I've had quite a lot of pressure from my sons, none of whom are yet completely vegetarian, certainly to have a look at that issue and see where I stand on it. In fact, we've been watching this film called Cowspiracy and another one called Seaspiracy, and it really does make you think about them things. But you have to also remember that they are polemics, so they are really looking at one side. And I saw another one recently called Kiss the Ground, and actually I felt this much more reflected where I come from, and you'll have to have a look. It's on Netflix. But essentially what it was saying is less meat, but better meat. And, that's the approach that I take. So another issue that I've done quite a lot of talking about is in relation to plastic bags. Now, this slide comes from, I'm in the green tracksuit because I did a series of regular programs on the This Morning program with Richard and Judy. And I did a different topic each week. This particular one was on waste. Unfortunately, I've lost all the other ones, so it's the only one I got. But when I was up there in Newcastle filming, one day I realised that I'd forgotten to take any clean knickers. So I went to M&S and I bought one of their multi-pack of knickers, and I was queuing in the things. This was about 1990, maybe 89, 90, in the queue. And I got to the front. It's actually rather a long queue. And the woman said, here's your bag. And I said, no, I don't want a bag. And then she said, no, you have to have a bag. So I said, no, I do not want a bag. I'm not having a bag. And after a little bit of a standoff and people getting a little bit impatient, she said, I'm going to call the manager. So I thought this was a little excessive, but anyway, she called the manager and I said, look, I've got a receipt. I've bought the things. I'm definitely not going to have a bag. I think it's wasteful, etc., etc. So eventually I was allowed out without the bag, of course, because there was no way I was going to have one. And it was interesting. So I'm telling that story a few weeks later. I was being interviewed by the Today newspaper. That's why I put it up there. Didn't last very long, and they ran a headline across the middle pages, and it said, "Green Princess risks arrest in M&S." So that was brilliant, because it really sort of put the issue out there and started people thinking, well, do they really need a bag and everything? And then few months later, I was on the tube and I saw on an M&S bag, no less, please reuse this bag for the sake of the environment. So I felt that was like a personal success that I had. But 10 years later, I did some work for M&S. When we wrote the Green Consumer Guide, we actually had them in as a bit of a laggard. But 10 years later, they were really starting to think about this thing seriously. And I was asked as a consultant to come and have a look right across their food division about all the issues, like an environmental audit of what they were doing. And it was like a precursor, hopefully most of you will come across this, to their plan A, because there is no plan B. And I have to say that I'm really impressed with the approach that M&S has taken and continues to take, which is that they don't just take the approach of thinking, what does the public think is the right thing, but they start looking at what makes sense from an environmental point of view, and then they have to educate the public to follow, which is very different to what many other companies do. So I also advise them on bags as well. I'm not going to spend too long on the bag issue because it's something that I've done many speeches on plastics. However, reusable bags are certainly the best, but only if you reuse them multiple times. I mean, I do happen to have rather too many reusable bags because you're quite often given them and then obviously you keep them, but they start making sense if you use them 70, 80, 90 times or whatever, because you have to think that they do also need resources. So if you're getting a new reusable bag all the time, then it would be much better to have a disposable one. But there are a lot of other things that people may not be aware of, like paper bags. Some situations they might be the right thing, but they're 10 times bulkier than the equivalent plastic bag and 6 times heavier, which means 10 times more lorries to bring them to the store. So you have to think when you're making these choices of the whole life cycle impact. Now, one of my least favorite options is actually biodegradable bags, or even worse, photodegradable bags. They put them in a home compost, they're very unlikely to degrade in time. Put them in an industrial compost, they'll be fished out because they won't be able to identify them from other plastics. They actually contaminate the recycling if you put them in a recycling bank. So it doesn't make sense to do that. And people think that it's a magic bullet, and it really isn't. So this logo that I've got, do you see at the top, it says Happy News, this is a climate positive bag made from recycled stone, no less. And I received that only last week. So I wrote back to them saying, well, I wasn't really very convinced that this seemed like a particularly good option, because what on earth was I supposed to do with it? It came with a sort of plastic sticker on the front. And they said, here are the things that they told me I could do with it. I could put it in the waste to energy bin. Well, where is my waste to energy bin? Have you got one? I certainly don't. Put it in the plastics recycling bin. Well, that's not a great idea, as I've just explained, contaminates the other plastics. And then the third option is that it's photodegradable. So actually, don't put it in your compost because it's not biodegradable, it's photodegradable in the sunlight. So you're supposed to lie it on the ground where litter in the countryside for the sun to break it down. I can tell you it takes at least 2 years, and this is a really thick bag. I should think it would take probably 5. So sometimes people don't think enough about what they're doing and whether it really makes environmental sense. They're just thinking about the strap lines. Now, the next section is really focusing on my boys. When I brought them up, these are the 3 of them on the left-hand side when they were little, I thought, well, I didn't really tell them enough about what I was doing. In fact, I think sometimes I might have slightly embarrassed them. When they were at this school in Somerset, one of the things that used to really annoy me, and I am a little bit of a campaigner in virtually all the things that I do, whether I go on holiday or in the children's school or whatever it happens to be. So I noticed that they had a door to the school changing room, the sports room, and they always left it open even when it was freezing cold outside. So they let all the warm air, they made sure the changing rooms were very warm, all the warm air sucking out of the door. And I kept complaining to the headmaster, who seemed to ignore me. So I wrote a blog about it I happened to be writing blogs at the time for the Telegraph. So I wrote a blog on the Telegraph website and I sent it to him. Safe to say, actually, he wasn't all that pleased. Anyway, luckily, my green philosophy did rub off on my children, and my eldest son, Connor, has set up 2 companies, one of which is Rubbish Ideas, and the second is the Rubbish Project. And they're focusing really on the circular economy and changing the system that we have of waste. So instead of having a sort of linear system where you dig stuff out of the ground, you use it, chuck it away, and that's it. Is to try and make it so that once we've dug something out of the ground, that we use it again and again and again in this lovely closed loop system, so we are not continuously adding to the mountains and mountains of waste. Now, the first incarnation of the business very much focused on these cups selling to festivals, so making the cups from 100% recycled plastic and then collecting them back and then turning them back into cups again. So a lovely closed loop system. And this is Connor and his business partner Jack at the Pride Festival in Weston-super-Mare, where they did, not only did they do all the waste, but they also had these lovely posters and all sorts of rather fun things there. But of course, it's not a great business to be in festivals and parties and events at the moment, because suddenly COVID struck. So that could have been the death knell, but luckily they were very innovative, and they've moved into really helping companies look at the circular economy and how to work it out for whatever business that you're in, and then also becoming a logistics business. So these are lorries with their logos on, just to illustrate the fact that they are providing recycled plastic material to a big client, and we're hoping that that's going to start being a continuous business. They're also doing a whole range of different things, but 3D printing using recycled plastic, working on some sort of huge building in Amsterdam. There's a whole range of really exciting ideas. So if you think there's anything that you need being done, ask Connor, although he might not be able to do it because he's rather busy. One area that I was thinking that he might be able to help with is the dreadful waste that has been created by COVID, and I'm not going to elaborate on that, but you must all be aware that all these bloody disposable masks just being chucked absolutely everywhere. 50 million masks go into landfill every day, and obviously some of them don't get there, and it's really chronic. And I do think that people need to be much more aware that when one issue comes out, please don't ignore all the other issues that are out there, and that the amount of waste plastics in our health sector is absolutely disgusting and not as necessary as it might seem to be, with a little bit of care and attention. Okay, so my youngest son, Monty, is also rather passionate about green issues. His focus is really on energy and on impact investing. In fact, I've put him completely in charge of my pension. He's been rather successful, so I'm really happy to do that and make sure that what I'm investing does some good. And this is his website, so you can have a look at that. Now, where he particularly helped me was in relation to Big Yellow. I joined the board of Big Yellow. It's a self-storage company. And I was really excited about the idea of more solar panels on their roofs. And I couldn't really see why they couldn't do a whole lot more, but realized that actually one of the reasons is because commercially at the moment, it makes much more sense to use the energy that you produce from solar. And if you start having to sell it back to the grid, it doesn't make so much sense. So I recruited Monty, and he and I wrote this report for Big Yellow to show all the sort of things that they might be able to do in terms of improving their energy and therefore increasing the solar panels on their roof. Energy local, there's batteries, time of use tariffs, all sorts of things, and lots of them, this is Big Yellow with some of the solar panels on their roof, a lot of them was really helped by Octopus Energy. In our research, we decided to switch to Octopus at our home supply as well. And what we decided was that Big Yellow could not just be looking at net zero by a certain date. They should be looking at being climate positive, actually emitting less carbon than they were producing. So being a positive force rather than negative. And that's so true for many, many companies. You've got to look at what you can do and try and do the maximum rather than just meet some arbitrary target. Not so brilliant was I then had to resign from the board. I think the chairman of Big Yellow found me a bit too challenging, but the report hasn't gone to waste, because Monty and I are now working with Chapter Zero. They'll be trying to educate non-executive board members about the impacts of climate change. So we're adapting our report to show company directors all the issues to do with energy and show them what they could and should be doing. So that's exciting. Now, I thought you might feel that you'd missed out on my third son. This is my middle son, Rollo, and he's a designer, so not quite so relevant on the green front, although he says that some of his outside lighting here, he does provide sort of gripping points for plants, nesting birds, biodiversity, and he's also working on 3D printing designs with recycled plastic. So coming back to where I live, many of you will sympathise that I've actually been 8 years dealing with builders. There are many green features in here, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but we do have solar and air source heat pumps and LED light bulbs and various other things. But probably what people don't always think about is that we have a zoning system in our building so that you don't have to have the heating on all at the same time. We actually have different heating on at different times of day in different rooms, all automated by an app. And that technology, when we put it in, was very new. It's becoming better and better all the time. So one quick thing that I would recommend that you would do is to put in zoning and app controlled heating, so you can turn on and off your bedroom. And then this is our studio. And in fact, here we've used underfloor heating because we have the air source heat pump, and the air source heat pump doesn't heat the water as hot as our boiler, and therefore it's not so good with radiators. But underfloor heating means it gives a sort of low, gentle heat, and that can be much more efficient. So we do have a boiler in there, but it only kicks in, hopefully, very small amount of time when it's really, really cold and the air source heat pump can't work. But much more exciting was our wilding project, which we started working with Operation Future Hope last year. This gives you an idea of what are the best bits of it. We have a sort of field opposite, which was doing very little, had sort of fence along the side, and we took out the fence and we just put in 12 ponds, all fed by springs. And it's still at fairly early stages, which is why it looks a bit bare, but it's just beginning to green up and get more and more species designed in there. And in fact, we've put in lots of bird boxes. We've got boxes for barn owls, boxes for woodpeckers, and even boxes for swifts, and all sorts of ways of encouraging them to come, which obviously Operation Future Hope will be able to tell you more, but also you can have a look on my website because I've done blogs about many of these things. But one of the issues I was really scandalized about is that when I was trying to buy trees and other plants, I realized that many of them were still being grown in peat. And this was like a particular surprise to me because I first came across this issue over 20 years ago, and peat is extremely environmentally damaging. So anybody out there who's thinking about using it should not, and I will explain a little bit more. The reason I got the National Trust and South Somerset District Council was because I used to sit as a councillor for SSDC, as it's called, and I was trying to get them to be, this is about 2000, I was trying to get them to be aware about how bad peat was, and I made up a poem for the council meeting, and I said, if the National Trust can go peat free, why not the SSDC? And I don't know that they took that much attention because I couldn't see anything about it on their website. But the National Trust has been really good. So for over 20 years now, they've had a policy of not using peat in National Trust properties. Now, it isn't absolute because what I've discovered is that they don't buy peat in the compost or even in the plants that they grow, they specify it. And I think they've been really effective at getting some of the garden centres to change, at least for them. It's very, very difficult even then to get to plant plugs, you know, those little plugs in multi-trays. It's very difficult to get them. I've written a blog about this. I really advise you to have a look and ask your garden centre, tell them that you do not want to buy peat products, because the only way that we are going to get that change is through consumer demand. The government put a voluntary target to eliminate peat from garden centres by 2020. They just hardly changed at all. And the reason really is because there's so much ignorance, people don't know how important it is. I forgot to say, whilst only 3% of the land area in the UK is taken up with peat, they store 30% of soil carbon, a staggering 3.2 billion tonnes in the UK alone. So, you know, from a climate change point of view, it is really one of the really, really big issues. And we import lots of peat, so it's not even just what we're doing in the UK, it's overseas as well. Yes, that's them cutting up the peat. So then I go to the marvellous David Attenborough. The really wonderful thing is that obviously he's been doing these marvellous documentaries for many years, but actually it's only in the past sort of 5, maybe 10 years that he's really started waking up to the real environmental impacts that he has been such a witness to. And I think it's marvellous that he's written this book, My Witness Statement and a Vision for the Future. And there's also on Netflix, there's another thing to watch on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend watching it. I think it's fantastic that he highlights the importance of biodiversity. But he also shows some rather startling statistics. So I was born in 1961. He uses 1960 as one of his base years. In 1960, the world population was 3 billion. In 2020, it's 7.8 billion. So, I mean, that is just staggering. Carbon in the atmosphere, 1960, 315 parts per million, 2020, 415 parts per million. Remaining wilderness, 62% in 1960, but 2020, only 35%. So I think that's really shocking. I realise I'm slightly running out of time, so I'm just going to go through my next two sessions quite fast, and I'll probably miss out a few things, for which I apologise. So my next session is on Africa. I've been involved in Africa starting in 1992. I went over and got a UN Global 500 award for outstanding environmental achievement, and I met this marvellous man who really deserved the award far more than I did. He's called René Haller, and he showed me some of the things that he had been doing in this old cement, well, this working cement quarry, mining out the coral, and he had just brought this wonderful ecosystem of wildlife and animals, and lots of things that he also produced for the local population, tree planting and fish farms and things. These lovely millipedes eat the casuarina needles from the trees and turn it into humus, and then he built all these wonderful things that he grew from that. And then I co-founded the Haller Foundation with marvellous Louise Piper, who really was the main person behind it. And our idea was to take the ideas from René out into the community. And so we've got dams here in the top left. We've got people digging dams and they did wells as well. And then in the middle at the bottom, we've got René coming out of one of his marvellous loos that he created to give them more hygiene and things. And lots of tree planting and education and organic and all those type of things. Really, really innovative. Haller now is focused on, in particular, the Haller app, which is helping subsistence farmers with advice on how to farm in a greener way and more tree planting and all that type of thing. So have a look at their website. I think it's being posted on the chat. My involvement with Haller meant that when I went on a camel safari a few years ago, I met this other marvellous African lady, Helen Douglas de Fresney, and she has founded this organisation, the Milgis Trust, and all the money from the camel safaris goes into the Milgis Trust. And they're also doing dams, they're doing health, they're doing schools. You can see this picture in the bottom middle, not burning the forest, not keeping too much livestock in the area, not cutting trees and taking care of the environment. So all the sort of things that we believed in. I loved her, and I went to see her afterwards, and I got them involved with the next organisation that I have joined and become a board director of, Chase Africa. Started initially with more looking at the same things that we were at Haller and Milgis in terms of tree planting and education on environmental things, but moved to recognising the real importance about family planning and giving women the right to choose. Because by effectively having lots of children, they were unable to work and they got trapped in a cycle of poverty, and then obviously also destroying the landscape around them, which is supporting them. So there's the whole range of issues that are encapsulated in the issue of family planning, much wider than that. And Chase has started working with the Milgis, so it's wonderful having a sort of synergy between the organisations. My final section before the conclusion is on green endings. Now, lots of people are rather uncomfortable with talking about death and dying. When I wrote the New Green Consumer Guide, I found it really fascinating. I got really quite involved, and I had these death tips that I put in a nice little box on there. And I went down to give a speech at the Eden Project. You'll see Tim Smith on the top right-hand side of this slide, who's the founder of the Eden Project. And he was absolutely hilarious because he read out the death tips as part of my introduction. It's sort of in the way that Rowan Atkinson might, and it had everyone in absolute stitches, which meant that it was quite difficult to continue with the speech that was as amusing as he was. Now, I'm going to show you three things about green death, one of which many of you may not have come across, this resumation. And it's an alternative to cremation and much more green. I first wrote about it in 2010. Instead of using fire, you use water and you dissolve in a sort of alkaline solution, which actually can go down the drain, so it's completely non-toxic. And your bones dissolve into sort of white powder instead of all the sort of dirty ashes and things. But it also has 1/4 of the carbon footprint of crematoria and no mercury pollution. You may not be aware, but actually mercury pollution from crematoria is huge, particularly with my generation dying because of all the fillings that we had and the mercury pollution coming from the fillings. So in a crematoria, average body weighs 67 kilograms and it produces 44 kilograms of CO2, another 50 kilograms of fuel used in the cremation, and 83 kilograms to burn the coffin. Just as an aside, fatter bodies use less fuel because obviously you use the fat from the body. But resumation isn't widely available yet. It is in Scotland, the Netherlands, and the US. I was talking to Sandy Sullivan, who's the chap behind it, a couple of weeks ago to get an update. And he said, we don't actually need money. We just need the clients willing to place the order. I have to admit that I thought that was quite funny. So the next is the eco-coffin coffin at the top. I just think it's rather beautiful. I was thinking of hanging one on my kitchen ceiling. Unfortunately, it's not available anymore because it was quite expensive to produce. So that's out of things. But the mycelium coffin below is just becoming available. And there's the web link there. And so mycelium are wonderful sort of living organisms in the ground. And they really will be not only rotting themselves in terms of the coffin and the moss lining inside, but they actually help decontaminate the toxins that are in your body. So really interesting solution. I'm certainly going to look into that. And then the other option is a lovely woolen shroud. And this company, Bella Couche, make these gorgeous woolen shrouds, which do biodegrade in the ground, particularly with shallow graves, which is if you want something to biodegrade, you need to do. And they've really thought about their product really carefully. They use primitive sheep and then lots of welfare practices. It's really good. And you end up all sort of being wrapped up in a rather cozy woolen shroud, all beautifully decorated. So I was thinking that my lovely mother, who isn't that far away from dying, she's got dementia. I just thought I had to show you her in her prime because she's so gorgeous. And we are thinking about what we will do. And I think that probably the woolen shroud will do for her, although I think I might go for the mycelium coffin when it comes to my time. Okay, so coming to my conclusion. In 1989, I spoke at the Green Party conference and I was slightly booed and heckled from the audience because I was a bit on the extreme of sort of why have we got someone on the platform who's making money from the environment too much on the corporate side, having got the other side of it from ICI. You know, the Green Party at that stage and green politics and green issues were very much more of a fringe issue. But watching Greta Thunberg on Netflix this week, it's just absolutely staggering, the support that she's engendered. And I just think it's absolutely wonderful. So I watched I Am Greta, which is the first one on BBC iPlayer. And she's then also got a 3-part, A Year to Change the World. It's really, really riveting. I absolutely recommend it. But the exciting thing is that it does, along with Extinction Rebellion, you can see that the youth today are really engaged with these issues. Now, exciting, fantastic that they are, but the reality is that it's actually rather frightening as to why they are. And the reason why they are is because that this is not so much anymore just about sustainability, that it's actually, we're almost too late with this idea that we're going to go on living in a sustainable way where we can go on doing the same things. We're not doing that. We are plundering the planet. And now we have to think, move on from just sustainability. We have to think about regeneration, restoration, renewables, recycling, repairing, and of course, most important of all, rewilding. And so I really hope that you will support Operation Future Hope, who are doing such a good job at focusing on educating the young at a really early stage, but also on this really, really important issue of biodiversity and rewilding. We welcome questions from anybody on any issue, and Lesley is going to join me. We'd be really delighted to help.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was fascinating and very inspiring. Let's see what questions we have. I did see one on compostable bags. Do you have that one, Zehan?
Hi, Julia and Lesley. That was really amazing to hear both of you speak. And there's such a wealth of information. I've been noting down lots and lots of bits of information. And Lynn has done a great job at putting all the links on the chat boxes as well. And we also will be putting them into our thank you email to everyone. So don't worry if you couldn't get everything down. We will send you the links that Julia mentioned. We have a question here that came in from Jordan Page Thompson about what's the alternative to bags for home compost. I think that was in reference to what you said, Julia, about photodegradable bags. Would you like to?
Effectively, it's really tricky because if you have a paper bag, you can put it in your compost and you can burn it on your fire, but you have to think that most people are not going to be putting it on their compost. They might almost certainly end up putting it into landfill sites, and you don't want a paper bag in a landfill site because it will rot and release greenhouse gases, and you don't want biodegradable stuff in landfill sites. So there are things that will biodegrade on your compost, but generally not the biodegradable plastics. And I have occasionally tried, when I got one of those envelopes, to put it in my compost, and I'm not really sure whether it has broken down or not, but I think that most of them don't. And for those that do, how many people are putting them in their compost, really? Even if they do, they probably take a lot longer than all the other organic matter that you put in there. So it's not really an ideal solution. And if it contaminates the recycling and you can't put it in the landfill site, what do you do with it? So this applies to cutlery and crockery, you know, disposable plates and all that type of thing. Don't just get a biodegradable thing and then think, oh, what do I do with it? And then you just chuck it in the bin. Well, what's the point? Get something that is properly recyclable, and preferably made of recycled materials as well.
May I interrupt to follow up on that question? Because this is something we're finally, having moved 4 times in 4 years, we're finally settling down, and we've just ordered our composter. So I guess that means we're going to be walking out of the house and directly putting it in there rather than keeping it in a small bin in the kitchen in order to transport and outgo the compostable bags. What about regular waste for the house? Because we did get supposedly biodegradable bin bags for the regular waste, which we try to keep to a minimum. So we don't have them for the recycle bin, and then you've got, you know, waste bins throughout the house for other bathrooms. This is something that drives me round the bend trying to find a solution for.
Okay, well, I think that my solution may be slightly unpalatable to some people, but I don't have any plastic bags in my compost bins.
I didn't used to.
I have one compost bin that goes to the real compost outside, and then the meat and real sort of cooked food waste goes to the council to be made into biogas. Now, I rang up the council because I saw that they had advised people to put those in biodegradable bags, but I rang them up to find out. I said, well, what do you do with those biodegradable bags? They fish them out of the compost. They don't actually put them in there to things. So actually, much, much better not to have a bag. And the only reason they advise people in there, because they think more people will do the waste if it's not so yucky. And my advice is put up with a bit of yuck. Don't put a bag in your bin. Tip it in straight into the brown compost waste bucket and wash out your bucket afterwards.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for that. Julia, I have a question which was not on the chat, but was raised with me earlier, which is, what can I do in my own garden?
What can you do in your own garden? Well, I don't know how big your garden is. We've got a sort of dead hedge where we're all the sort of garden waste that we're piling up. No bonfires. I am really against bonfires in your garden. My mother was very keen on that. But we've made this lovely dead hedge, and apparently it's really suitable for hedgehogs. So we're thinking that when it's the right season and that we're able to do a rescue hedgehog, we're going to try and get some hedgehogs in there. Obviously, no peat. Absolutely, please. Not only do I want you not to use peat, but I want you to make a big fuss about it at the garden centres when you go and buy any plants, because that is absolutely dreadful. Bird boxes, I mean, that is the most wonderful thing. I'm terribly excited about my bird boxes. They haven't yet got any inhabitants, but they haven't been up very long. Desperate to get a little sort of sign saying, you know, barn owl over here, woodpeckers come over here. So hopefully we've put them in the right place. The Barn Owl Trust actually give you really good things about the types of boxes that you can have and that type of thing. The other thing is I've got wonderful people helping me with Lesley. They've got this idea of monitoring on a weekly basis, doing what they call a butterfly transect. We can have a sort of route through the garden where we can check what butterflies we're seeing on a weekly basis and record it and send it back. I'm not sure what organisation Lesley might be able to say where you said
conservation. Yeah, the butterfly conservation. And just actually while Judy's talking, this is a great book called Wild Your Garden by the Butterfly Brothers. Highly recommend it. Full of plant lists. All different options you can do for your garden, bird boxes, as Julia said, how to put up bird boxes, where to put them, all that sort of thing. Wealth of knowledge. So I recommend that to everybody.
And providing good nesting site for birds. So there's lots of places to find out what sort of things that you can do to encourage more wildlife. But I'm really excited about how many there are. And there's also frogs and amphibian group. Can't remember what they're called, but anyway, I've joined them because I love frogs and toads and newts and all that type of things. And in our pond area, we're beginning to get all those as well. So lots of things I think to do in the garden.
Fantastic, thank you for that.
Jenny, there was a question here for Lesley. There were a couple of people mentioned about starting out similar schemes in schools in Hampshire and Hertfordshire, but there's one particular question here for Lesley. Have you branched out to other organisations such as day centres for people living with dementia, or setting up something with keen gardeners to maximise protection of our ecosystems? This could help both ways.
No, it's a very good question. We're focused primarily on schools at the moment. It's limitless. In fact, one of the things we're doing, or in the first stage of writing a rewilding manual, this is actually helping us to reach lots of schools, and basically any school anywhere. So there's definitely potential in the future for expanding and not just working in schools, but in the wider community. I think it's an excellent idea, but not something we've branched out to yet.
That actually just sounds a really clever idea, to do a book, something that different schools could use, because, you know, or different organisations. So I'm sure that would be really useful if you are working on that.
Yeah.
Just something about care homes that I think might be worth bringing up is that one, as I said, my mother's got dementia, she's in a care home. It's a really good one, very, very nice. But one of the things I've noticed visiting a number of care homes is that they produce so much food waste because they tend to give people much more food than they are ever likely to eat, probably double that, and they give them in sort of like set portion containers. And I just think that one of the many campaigns that I might start launching is in relation to getting care homes to think much more carefully about how much food the residents are likely to eat, and not giving them far more than that and causing all that food waste. Just another issue to throw in the mix.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, one last question, and I'm seeing one that's come up here. Julia, what are your view on sustainable labels and the degree to which they're in the pay of the food industry?
The answer is that when we started out doing the green consumer things, there was a lot of issues about greenwashing and people putting on labels, and there were a plethora of labels without a lot of standards about what they really mean and whether they're the right thing. And in some ways we've come across that with this biodegradable bags and photodegradable, etc. And I think it's tricky because you want people to be talking about what they're doing, because one of the results of people making a fuss about greenwashing is that companies then think, well, they'll do something, but they won't really talk about it. So you've got to get the balance of the fact that you want them to talk about what they're doing and tell people about what they're doing, because it again gives them an incentive to do it. At the same time, you obviously don't want them to be misinforming people and exaggerating what they're doing. It is important that that is picked up by campaigners, and people are keeping an eye on that when people are misinforming. And I think that the example that I gave you is that the company behind it, I think is probably a really good company. They're terribly keen on environmental stuff, but if you remember, I showed you this on my, I can't really get it there, but you get the picture. I'm sure they have a very good intentions in terms of what they're doing, but actually they have really come across like the worst possible option in terms of their bag, really through ignorance. So I research the options properly, think really carefully about the life cycle impact, and make sure that they are accurate. And if you see people who aren't doing it, pick it up and try and encourage them.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you to you both for taking questions. Those really inspiring and interesting talks. And now I'd like to hand back to our president, Siobhan, for some final words.
Can I just say thank you everybody for coming and being a part of this, and please do have a look at the websites, Operation Future Hope and Julia Hales. Send comments in, all welcome, and really get involved in some of these issues, because that would really make it worth talking to you today.
Thank you so much for that inspiring, and fact that the information in your talk is phenomenal. And how you can keep it all in your head is just, it's very impressive. And you've been doing groundwork for the future and working with the organisations and changing their minds. And I love the McDonalds example. That was a real coup. And I think from there on, it probably made you braver in terms of people like ICI and all the others. So well done on that. And what is alarming, actually, is the statistics and how, in what time scale is this going to take to manage better in the future? And I think your whole idea of inspiring the young people to adopt this within the school environment, so they're sharing it across lands, is totally wonderful, and well done to you. You're an absolute ace. And so is Lesley, of course, as the founder who started this whole project off. I'm most impressed, I'm sure we all are.